All right. Well, hey everyone, or anybody who's here and listening. I I thought I would hop on and just do a quick stream or chat about Saint Therese since it's her feast day today. Um, Recently I made my definitive promises as a secular Carmelite, and I've been reading the Carmelites for probably about 15 years now. I first started reading a long time ago, 15 years ago, and I've been formally a part of the Carmelites and formally studying the Carmelites for about 9 years as a secular. And in the last 2 years, I have been studying closely the story of the soul and Saint Therese's last conversations, the recorded conversations of Saint Therese with her sisters. And you know, from from the beginning, whatever 15 years ago, when I first started reading Saint Therese, I have always really struggled to read her. I that she's such a popular saint, and so many people love her, so many people recommend her, and for good reason. But my introduction to the Carmelites was St. John the Cross. And, for whatever reason, that St. John really stuck with me. And his vision, or the way he laid things out, the way he laid out the interior life, was something that really spoke to me. And, as soon as I read Ascent to Mount Carmel, I was just immediately like, this is the way to go. This is the way. This is how one should structure their spiritual life. And then to go, I think, from St. John the Cross to St. Therese was difficult, because I think I wanted something more, dogmatic, or something more doctrinal, something more scholastic and orderly. And I always viewed Story of the Soul as kind of just, an autobiography, just a writing about her life. And it wasn't even, perhaps her like overly pious or overly sentimental way of speaking, or, her supposed sugary sweet way of talking about the spiritual life and, her relationship with Jesus. It was, just, I was, looking for something different, like I said, something more academic, almost like in St. John the Cross. But after studying her for the last 2 years, I really, it really changed my mind about her completely. And it was one particular passage from Story of the Soul, which I have right here, this edition. I also have the study edition, which is worth picking up. But this is the first one I have. I'll try to find it. This is when I really, I had it bookmarked. This is when I really realized there was something about Saint Therese that was deeper, and, like I said, actually kind of tough. But in Story of the Soul, she says that she offered herself to Jesus as his little plaything. And she said, I offered myself for some time to the child Jesus as his little plaything. I told him not to use me as a valuable toy children are content to look at but dare not touch, but to use me like a little ball of no value, which he could throw on the ground, push with his foot, pierce, press it to his heart if it pleased him. In a word, I wanted to amuse little Jesus. So the reason why I think this particular passage from St. Therese really sticks out is that it shows her kind of her grit, that her spirituality is ultimately one of complete abandonment to whatever the will of God is. And that's even to be of little value, to be a toy that is of no value, and even to be discarded or abandoned. Like you said, you could treat me like a ball you'd leave on the ground and push into a corner and never look at. So, to follow her little way, part of that is to be willing to be seen as of no value. And in fact, that if it gives Jesus pleasure, if it is his will for you to be left in a corner, that you abandon yourself to that. That you should just whatever it is his good pleasure, whatever God's good pleasure is, that is what you accept as your lot. And that's part of her littleness, right? Is that she's not, she's not, I guess, strong enough to, or as she would say, grown up, that carries a lot of connotations. But it's not that she wants to, kind of assert her own will, but whatever God's will is for her. She, in a different place in her, I believe it's her act of oblation, she says that she wants to be treated as a grain of sand that is seen as valueless and can be trampled underfoot. So, I mean, this is really kind of tough, like hardcore language from a saint that is often seen as, I think so sweet, at least from appearances or from the outside. There's that saying, was it little flower in this hour, show your power, like that's obviously her. I mean, she calls herself the little flower, so it's obviously a fitting title. But I think people hear that and they hear the little way and such like that. And they walk away with the idea that Saint Therese is easy to follow. And it's not the case at all. To follow in the little way is, again, to become something valueless. And that's quite a death to the ego, to be willing to become nothing. As she says throughout her writings, I am nothing. God is everything. I have nothing of my own. That really comes through in the book, her last conversations, which is, you can kind of read in companion with Story of the Soul. I think it's broken up into 3 manuscripts. Story of the Soul, manuscript C, the last one. They kind of coincide when she's beginning to die of tuberculosis and she's moved to the infirmary. But something else I think that really draws a lot of people to Saint Therese is her kind of interior frustration with wanting to be everything. Famously, she said, she wanted to be a priest. She wants to be an apostle. She wants to be a prophet. She wants to be a teacher. She wants to be all these different, vocations. And it's kind of an odd thing because she brings up the idea of vocation while she's in Carmel, while she's in the convent. And you think, well, once you're in the convent, that's kind of your vocation, right? You're now a nun. But it seemed like Saint Therese was looking for a vocation within a vocation, and she wanted, again, to be all these other things. But she was a cloistered Carmelite, and she was a woman, or she's a woman, so she couldn't be a Catholic priest, and she couldn't be a missionary. So how would she fulfill these desires? And I think there are many, particularly lay people in the church, who feel very similar. That they have a lot to offer. They have a lot of gifts. They have a lot of talents, and they don't know. Beyond, I guess I should say, beyond gifts and talents, they feel as though God has put a calling on their heart, and they're not sure how to fulfill this role. And Saint Therese kind of has a Saint Augustine moment, the take and read tolle legere moment, and she's looking through the New Testament. She comes across 1 Corinthians 13 about all these gifts. This is a very popular story, so if you know it, I'm sorry. Of all these gifts of being a teacher, of being an apostle, of being a prophet, none of them are of any value without charity, without love. Love is the core of all these things. And as she says, the apostles would cease to preach if love is extinguished. Martyrs will cease to die. Missionaries will cease to spread the gospel. So at the core of all vocations, what fulfills them is love. And It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter your vocation. If this is at the core, you can live out any of these other aspects if you have love, if you infuse these things with love. And she shows herself to be, a real daughter of Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa of Avila, I think, in that discovery. As Saint John will say, where there is no love, place love, and you'll find love. It's love alone is credible, right? And it's it's love that becomes the animating principle for all the activities of vocations and in the church. And same thing with Saint Teresa of Avila, that, and she says, the nuns and others will kind of make excuses as to why they can't achieve great things. And these objections, she says, can be met by doing what you can in the present moment, doing the task that's in front of you. And by doing that task with great love, you can kind of go beyond the cloister. You can go beyond whatever confines you find yourself in. And I think this really speaks to many lay people, many people who find themselves in seemingly mundane activities, of just married life, fatherhood, motherhood, being a husband, being a wife, and family life can seem so ordinary and so plain. And there's perhaps a great desire, if not for what Saint Thérèse said, about being a teacher or being an apostle, being a prophet, being a missionary, but at least the great desire to be holy and to be a saint. And, when you look at saints, you think, well, I don't have time. I don't have all that time to spend at church. I can't spend all my time praying. I can't, go to mass as much as I would like, and so on. Or, I can't do heroic deeds of virtue. So how in the world am I supposed to be a saint? How can this desire be realized? And Saint Therese gives a really great principle in her own thoughts and desires for sanctity and holiness. Her principle is, if God has inspired this desire in you, he will bring it to completion. He can't inspire anything in vain, as Saint Therese says. So if he's inspired this desire in you, doesn't mean that, of course, it's guaranteed, but God has given you a desire that he knows you can achieve, with some cooperation, his grace in your cooperation. He won't, kind of make you a saint apart from your own will and activity. But Saint Therese, I think, gives the path for that sanctity. And it's, again, this little way. It's this path of humility. It's this path of infusing all activity with great love and charity. And it can be done kind of anytime, any place, any vocation. And I think that's why she became a doctor of the church. Is, the Catholic Church realizes that what she has to offer, her teachings that you can find in her writings, really do reflect a universal truth that all people can realize. I mean, that's part of the idea of being a doctor. Is it's some teaching that is applicable, as far as I know. I should have looked it up. That informs the universal church. That all people, lay, religious, clerical, whatever it is, can glean from and can use, and in some ways moves the church's understanding of revelation or sanctity or such forward. And I think that teaching has been greatly taken up by the laity and her charge. But I think, other than this idea that she is or this other idea that she offers herself as this plaything, this ball to Jesus that he can discard or play with, or do whatever he wills with. There's also this great trial of faith that she has, great darkness of faith. It's recorded in, again, the last conversations, part of it, and then towards the end of Story of the Soul, she talks about how she really never experienced any sort of doubts about faith, and how, from her, earliest childhood into her time in Carmel, she hadn't, didn't really entertain any doubts, believed the teachings of the church, believed in heaven, of course, and the existence of heaven, and that she would go there. But then towards the end of her life, and when she gets sick, she begins to have these serious doubts about heaven. And it's interesting because she brings up the kind of the science of her time, and the famous, not by name, but alludes to the teachings of materialism and atheism and such. And at least in this study edition of Story of the Soul, I think it's Mark Foley Father Mark Foley argues that when Therese is mentioning the trial of faith and these temptations towards atheism, she mentions something about her brothers. And Mark Foley makes the argument that she's mentioning Nietzsche. There's a book, I haven't read it, I'm a little hesitant to read it, but it's I think it's like a mock conversation between Therese and Nietzsche, and on the nature of faith. And so towards the end of her life, she has these doubts, and she's given almost a taste of atheism. She begins this dark night of faith, as St. John of the Cross would call it. And this dark night of the faith is the seeming abandonment of God, that this joy that she had, and this confidence and assurity that she had in the existence of heaven, was beginning to be questioned. She was beginning to doubt it. And she has kind of these vivid imaginations of what the materialists will say to her, that she has this vision, not mystical. I think that's one of the interesting aspects of Saint Thérèse for some people, is that there's no recorded kind of extraordinary mystical events, no levitations or transverberations or something like that, or which is the piercing of the heart that you see with Saint Teresa of Avila. But so she has this image, I should say, more than a vision of a far distant land. She says, away from her homeland, away from her fatherland. And the land is kind of shrouded in fog and in darkness. And that's her, kind of separated from God and in this darkness and cloud. And the materialists say to her that essentially the darkness of the night that you experience now will be nothing compared to when you die and you realize that your faith has been for nothing. And that's a terrifying thought. And I wonder if, and I'm a Carmelite, I read Carmelite spirituality. It seems like this dark night of faith, even for someone like Saint Thérèse, no matter who you are, it has to be passed through. And for most people, it is sort of when the life's ending, is kind of on the horizon. The end of life is on the horizon, as it was for Saint Thérèse, at least at the beginning stages, that she knew she had tuberculosis, kind of the beginning of it, coughing up blood and such. And it's, I think, this invitation by Christ to kind of experience the desolation and the abandonment of the cross. So even someone like, sweet little Saint Thérèse experiences this anguish of abandonment, this idea that perhaps science is right. maybe the materialists, maybe the atheists are right. Maybe I'll die and there will be nothing. I think sometimes the idea that Saint Therese was given to despair and kind of true thoughts of suicide are a little overplayed, in my opinion. I think what she's really saying is, if this is true, if science, if the materialists, if the atheists are correct, then I would like, what, why wouldn't you end it? Why go through this? And I think it's more that she's kind of playing with that idea as she's suffering than the actual idea that she would ever go through any of these things, or that it was something that truly gripped her soul. Because even when she's talking about this kind of anguish of the trial and the dark night of faith, she's not saying that she gave into it, but that it's an extreme temptation. And so, when it comes to, I think some people's ideas of Therese and taking her own life or something like that, I think it's just this idea that Therese understands intellectually the logic of it, I suppose. That if you were to be of a certain mindset, if you were to be of a certain philosophical bent, without God, why not? But for Saint Therese, she's saying that it's just a trial that she has to be purified through, that she has to kind of take this bitter drink that Christ is offering her. But in its bitterness, she's actually growing closer to Christ through it. So, like I said, I'm curious if anybody else is ever, or if anyone else is familiar with that book of Saint Therese and Nietzsche. I think there's it's probably a highly apocryphal story that Saint Therese met Nietzsche on like an elevator. She went somewhere in Paris, I think. Yeah, it was either still somewhere in France or Italy, and there's a rumor that Nietzsche got on the elevator with her, or something like that. I don't know if that happened. Yeah, she refers to agnostics and atheists, and she says in Story of the Soul, she refers to the atheists of her age as her brothers. And Mark Foley says that perhaps it's Nietzsche that she refers to as her sick little brother, who through the abuse of grace lost this precious treasure, the source of only real and pure joys. So Saint Therese still has this grace. So even amidst the dark night, she still has real joy, as she would say, real and pure joy. But just she's not in her usual kind of sentimental way of speaking or something like that. She's going to be honest, I guess, about this temptation. She writes, "Science is unceasingly making new advances. Since science will explain everything naturally, we shall have the absolute reason for everything that exists, and that still remains a problem." In short, Saint Therese's doubts were expressive of the scientific age in which she lived, an age in which she could not be that which could not be verified by experimental or empirical evidence was called into question. So that's that section is from her last conversations. And then she has another one from Story of the Soul, when she says that when she's thinking about God and life and eternity, that she is clinging to a belief in it, that she kind of says she's continually making an act of faith that what she believes is true, even if she doesn't kind of have this feeling about it, or the same kind of elation or excited feeling that she had when she was younger. And now she's going through again, what St. John the Cross would call the dark night of faith, where the only kind of guiding thing for you is faith. That, all your other supports have fallen apart. And the only way through is to cling to what maybe some people might consider blind faith. But nonetheless, that's the only thing you have. St. John the Cross says that faith produces faith produces certainty, but not clarity. So you are certain that you are on the right path by following faith in the dark night. But because it's the dark night, you don't have clarity. You can't see. You are in this land that Saint Thérèse spoke of. That's a land of gloom and fog. That there's no light from the sun. So all you have is this thread to keep kind of pulling on and keep guiding you. So she she calls it her that no, she says that the materialists and the agnostics will say to her, and again in this image that she has, that the voices will say to me, "Are you sure of being loved by God? Did he come and tell you? It seems to me that the darkness, borrowing the voices of sinners, says mockingly to me, you are dreaming about the light, about a fatherland embrace, embalmed in the sweetest perfumes. You are dreaming about eternal possession of the Creator of all these marvels. You believe that one day you will walk out of this fog which surrounds you. Advance, advance, rejoice in death, which will give you not what you hope for, but a night still more profound, the night of nothingness." That's haunting, and this is, not, again, what Saint Thérèse believed, but it is what she kind of imagined what would be said to her. So these are, again, very dark words for, sometimes a flowery saint, at least can be characterized that way. That these materialists around her are saying that you are going to walk into a night of nothingness, that you will not receive what you hope for. And I think, I said this on a different podcast one time, but I think everyone has like a small glimpse of the dark night of faith here and there. And for me, it always happens at funerals. There's a moment where, you see the casket, especially, if it's, at the was a visitation, before the funeral. If it's an open casket, you look at the deceased person, and there's kind of this flash where I think perhaps this is it. Perhaps, I'm going forward, and what I hope for after death will be this night of profound nothingness. Maybe this is all there is. Usually that goes away pretty quickly, especially if the wake. There you go. Especially if the wake is followed by a mass. Because then I can reorient my thoughts towards the resurrection and towards faith. But I think I said, maybe some people experience this for many years for one reason or another. And I think it is important to distinguish maybe what I would call kind of a natural dark night of faith and a supernatural dark night of faith. The supernatural dark night of faith is what Saint Thérèse is going through and describing, and what Saint John the Cross describes as well. And it's the infusion of God withdrawing consolation from you, and it feels on our side like he's abandoning us, but in fact he's actually drawing closer than ever. But then there's the natural dark night of faith, and that's one that's produced usually what we could say from human weakness, from our own frailty, from our own sins, from our own negligence, our personal abandonment of God, whatever, in whatever form that is, of distancing ourselves. And so, we can think of these thoughts of the night of nothingness. But for Saint Therese, this this night of nothingness seems to have lasted for quite some time, and kind of flashes here or there of light, and you can see in her last conversations, which is kind of the prolonged conversations again towards the end of her life. But even then, she comes back to this idea that's very strange, but she insists that not only will she be a saint, but that she is a saint now. And that is a weird thing to say. I don't know if I could, in all good conscience, or even in all seriousness, say, I'm a saint. And there's a time when some sisters are taking care of her, and she seems kind of out of it, like maybe she's like asleep, or kind of, at least her eyes are closed. She's in some sort of agony, and they're taking care of her. And the sister says, she opens her eyes. Saint Therese opens her eyes and looks at them and says, "You're taking care of a little saint, don't you?" And there's another time where I think they're cleaning her up, and I think they're clipping her nails, and she basically says, "You should keep those nails, because one day I'm going to be a saint." And so how can one say that? How can she say that she's a saint? And this is a point of that I really resonate with her, which is, again, her great desire to be one, but yet it seems so impossible. And so I think in Saint Therese you have a a beautiful example of how humility and magnanimity, which is hard to say, great soulness, magna anima, great soul, how one can be of high mindedness, of great soulness, and humble. And in fact, St. Thomas Aquinas says that these are neighbor virtues of one another. So for Thomas, you really can't understand one without the other. I mean, you can, of course, in his Summa, he treats just one and just the other. But even within, when he's treating those, if you look at the replies and the said contras and such, he mentions in magnanimity, he mentions humility, and then humility, magnanimity, because they're so close, and they both have to deal with acting according to right reason. So they're under the virtue of temperance, which we usually think of moderation, but it could be argued means to act according to right reason. And so humility restrains us from kind of undue. It restrains us from acting inordinately against right reason, but magnanimity impels us to act according to right reason, to actually strive for great things. In fact, Thomas Aquinas says that to reject or shun a deserved honor is not good. That one should, in fact, have this high-mindedness that Aquinas talks about. One should actively strive for great things according to right reason, though. So humility is restraining us from going beyond what we are. So, Thomas will treat humility and great souledness, and then they're contraries. Kind of the small souledness and pride. So pride wants to be more than what one is. So it's an inordinate striving against right reason. But humility is to restrain. And all throughout, again, for Therese, to be little is to be humble. And she'll say that I have no virtues of myself. To be little is to be nothing. To realize that even my ideas are not mine. That if I have some sort of insight into the Gospels and I share it, this is Saint Therese, and I share it with one of the sisters, and then one of the sisters uses my idea, I should let it go. That idea, even the idea that I came up with or I think I was inspired, is not mine. I should relinquish all those things. So it's not this idea for Saint Therese that she is a saint because of anything she's done, but because everything God has done for her. So she's right to strive. In fact, we're all right to strive to be saints because we should strive for the highest honors that are according to right reason. And it is right reason to want to be holy. But know that our striving for it, our longing for it, is not to be done on our own, independent of God, or that it's all up to us. The little way is the extreme reliance on God. That's the idea of being children or being a child for Saint Therese is to be abandoned to God. That you are abandoned in the way that a child is. A child has complete confidence and a complete abandonment in what the Father wills for them. That the child cannot take care of themselves. They must rely on the Father. And that's part of humility is just receiving whatever the Father wills in complete surrender, abandonment, and poverty of, as Saint Therese would say, poverty of will, of poverty of spirit. So she says that to be little is to expect everything from God as a little child expects everything from its father. To be little is not attributing to oneself the virtue that one practices, believing oneself capable of anything, but to recognize that God places this treasure in the hands of his little child to be used when necessary, but it remains always God's treasure. So I think that is a near perfect summary of this interplay of great souledness and humility. That we are to be abandoned and to expect everything from God and attribute nothing to ourselves. So when Saint Therese says that, you're taking care of a little saint, I am a saint and I will be, it's not at all by her own merits, that she has done all these extraordinary things. In fact, she'll always talk about how she doesn't do anything extraordinary. And there's some of her sisters, when she died at Carmel, some of her sisters said that they were going to have a hard time creating an obituary for her. They really didn't know what to say, because from the outside, she was just kind of an average sister, an average nun. But she kept all these things, in a sense, sort of hidden, because she believed that, if God wanted, his little flower to blossom, to bear fruit, he would do it. And it wouldn't be required of her to do anything in particular, anything kind of heroic. Again, I think that's what makes her so attractive to, it's really to everybody, but especially to lay people, is this idea that you don't have to do anything super extraordinary, and you don't have to have, these otherworldly mystical experiences to be holy and to be a saint, but you just have to infuse everything you do, every action in your entire vocation. You infuse it with love, and from there, God will see to the rest. So I guess I'll end there. I feel like I talked a little bit longer than I wanted to. If hope everyone listening and watching enjoyed this little stream. I just wanted to get on here, like I said, and share a little something for her feast day. Maybe do another one. Saint Teresa of Avila is later this month on the 15th of October, so I'll do something for hers. But maybe between now and then, if there's any interest, we talk about Saint Therese some more. It's a great saint, and like I said, I struggled with her for a while, but maybe it's just kind of being contrarian, and everyone loves Saint Therese, so I don't need her. But these last 2 years, like I said, studying Story of the Soul and her last conversations really kind of changed my mind and my heart about her. That she is truly an amazing saint, and one that is very, very, very tough. Um, let me try to find a quote from her last conversations that I want to end on. She was talking to one of her sisters, one of her blood sisters, and Saint Therese was asking her if she had made any promise or any progress becoming a saint, and her sister replied that I promise you that I'll be a saint when you have left for heaven. At that moment, I will put my whole heart into it. Saint Therese replied, "Don't wait for that. Begin now. Begin now. Don't say that I'll be a saint when I'm in Carmel while waiting. I won't put myself out. But God showed me the value of time, and I did just the opposite of what I was thinking. I wanted to prepare myself for my entrance by being very faithful, and that's one of the most beautiful months of my life. Believe me, don't wait until tomorrow to begin becoming a saint. Believe me, don't wait until tomorrow to begin becoming a saint." So begin tonight, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Begin today to become a saint. All right. Thanks for listening.